Wow, what an explosion. Right, let's go ahead and actually create this in Blender so I can actually just show you how I actually achieve this. So I'm just going to add in an object, and the mesh object that we're going to add in is the icosphere, like that. And what this does is every face will actually produce the actual particles. So it'll actually do a spray effect. So let's just add that. And what I'm going to do is actually change that to emit, because it's an emitter. And I'm just going to actually, that's the emitter of my sparks. So we better add in some sparks. So I'll add in two items here. One's the emitter and the other's another icosphere, which I'm going to actually rename spark. I'm going to dumb down the actual other icosphere, and I'm just going to actually call it spark. Right, looking through our camera, if I click on here and then look through our camera, what I'm going to do is actually take the actual spark and actually move it off the shot. G and X, just to actually move it out of camera. And I'm just going to locate myself on it by pressing the actual full stop key, because I don't want this many faces, because I want to render different bits. So what I'm going to do is actually go on into edit mode by pressing the tab key and actually select a couple of faces by holding the shift key down, and I think I'll get rid of these two as well. So I'm just going to get rid of the faces by pressing the X key and delete faces. As you can see, we've now got a particle with holes in it, and this is going to be very useful for our reflections if you actually use an HDRI, or even if you just actually use reflections so the particles reflect on each other. So we've got this, and we'll work on the actual, first of all we're going to scale this down to something small, and what we're going to do is actually look at the base of this. I only want them to actually be generated out of the top of it, so I'm just going to press the 7 key to look from the top, hold the control key down, which actually makes it look from the bottom, and if I press the full stop key, that takes me to it again. Into edit mode, and I'm just going to select this point. You've got point select, line select and face select, so select the point at the base, and I'm just going to grow this selection by pressing the control key and pressing plus or CTRL, whichever you want to call it. I call it control, and just press the X key and we'll delete these faces as well. So at the minute we've got an actual emitter, but it's only one side of it, so things are going to go out of the top of it in this tutorial. Let's get a drink of coffee. Right, so we're going to add a particle. Hopefully that makes my voice sound a bit less tired. So I've already gone through this once and actually forgot to hit record. Right, add a particle system into this, and as you can see, our particles appear on the faces and actually just fall down to the ground. The source here is where they're coming from, so if it were coming from the actual verts, which is the points, then that would be there, but we're going to actually have this coming out of the faces because I think it's quite a good effect. Right, looking at our particle, we've got all these different things. The cache is where the actual, you can actually bake it to, which is always a good idea to bake before you do your final render, because what this does is actually fixes things in place and it stops glitches in your render. So you do that by just going on there and baking just before you actually render it. Right, what we've got is we've got velocity. Right, I've got velocity on the actual X, Y and Z. Just make that a little bit wider so we can see the X. So you've got X, so it can actually make it go that way, or you can make it go in the negative that way. But what we're going to do for this one is we're just going to actually put it to 0, and same with the Y direction along the green line, as you can see. I'll just set it to 0. So I want my particles to actually go up like an explosion would do. So we can actually just move this up. I'm just going to look through the camera by pressing 0. I want my particles to go up in the air, but not actually leave the screen. So I'm just going to actually increase this until they just short of the top of the screen, which is about, and they're leaving there, so it looks like it's about 6.5 in this case, but it just depends how you've got your settings on your computer, how far you want these to go. As you can see, it's pretty random, and that's because the faces are pretty random on an icosphere, so we don't really need to do anything more with that. But what we need to do now is we can actually change different bits on our velocity to make these particles go out to different places, if that's the effect you want to actually get. There's also this random button here and the object velocity. If we increase the object velocity, what it does is it times the actual normal velocity by a set amount. And if we actually increase this randomness, it decides how far it's going to actually fling them. If you look there, so it's actually flinging them at random amounts, which I think looks quite cool, because when you get an explosion, it's so chaotic, things go out at different speeds. So that's what I want to actually achieve. So object velocity, I'm just going to take it down so it's not too random. And that's my particle explosion done. But it looks more like a fountain at the minute. And the reason it looks like a fountain is because of the actual length of time that these last. In other words, these 1,000 particles are starting at frame 1 and they're ending at frame 200. Right, so they can actually start at frame 1, but I only want them, an explosion happens quickly and fast. So we want it to happen over a very short period of time. So I'm just going to change this to 15. So I've changed that to 15, boom, and we actually get that kind of effect. As you can see, my animation doesn't go much beyond 120 frames. So I'm just going to change it to 120, which means when it renders, you've got less things to render, which takes less time. Boom. Another thing that nobody ever shows you when they're actually showing a render is there's a way to actually speed up your render. And that is found in cycles, but it's also found on the denoising port here. But what we're going to do is I'll show you that when we actually change this over to cycles, because the effect that I'm going to show you later on in the video only works in cycles, and that's a color change on this. So we can actually make these particles have color and shape and move. As you can see, all the particles at the minute are round. That's because we're not actually using this shape as the particle yet, or the spark. So let's just actually add this into the spark. So select your emitter at the beginning. The other thing is I don't want really my emitter to actually show in my final render. So what we can do is actually, we've got the source here, and we can actually make it actually disappear. And I have pressed record this time at least. So you go into render, and you can turn off the emitter, so this actually stops it actually appearing in your render, which is the actual effect you want, because an explosion tends to actually come from another object, not the emitter itself. You can use the other object as the actual emitter of your explosion, but what you'd have to do is duplicate it so your base mesh isn't invisible basically on your render. Because if I take this onto render mode and render it, press F12, as you can see, there's nothing on the screen because the actual particles, one, haven't got an actual body yet, and the emitter is actually invisible anyway. Whoops, escape. Take us back into there. Let's just take it back down and just show you. See loads of particles on screen. F12, and we can't see a thing. That's because this emitter is actually just producing these particles, but these particles have got no form yet, and this is the form we want to use. So select this, and what we've got down here, we've got a thing called render, and at the minute it's set to halo, but we want it to actually be an object, and we want it to be our spark. So let's have a look, spark. As you can see, our sparks are quite small, so you can actually increase the size of them, and it's always a good idea to change the randomness, because now we've got small particles and larger particles in our render. Boom. Now, the reason I've left this quite long still to 120 frames is we're going to add another effect, because what particles tend to do, they tend to react with the actual ground plane that they're actually based on. So when they it actually bounces and things like that. So that's what we're going to work on now. So take it back into here because it's just that little bit clearer just to see. So we're going to add in a ground plane to affect our particles. So add in a mesh, and the ground plane is just going to be a common old garden plane. As you can see, I'm just going to drop the plane G and Z just to move it down slightly. So there's a little gap in between it, because I want these to actually come out of here and not go out of the plane at the bottom. I'm just going to scale this plane up to something stupid, and then just rotate it in the Z just to actually hide its edges. Right, you can actually change that the plane is visible in your render by actually just taking off the visibility. That does the viewport, and this does it in the render. And the beauty about that now is that we can actually use our plane to affect our particles. So we've got our particles. As you can see, they go straight through our plane and don't seem to react with it. That's because there's no physics. So we're going to actually add some physics basic properties to our plane. So select the plane, physics basic properties, which is this circle with the moon going around it. Could be the Earth and the moon, I suppose. And then hit collision. So we hit collision. So now our particles, when they actually are emitted, should react with our plane. Now this might not be the effect you're actually wanting for your plane. I think I'll scale that down slightly because I think they're a bit big still. And that's the other way you can actually scale down your particles, by actually the one it's copying to actually shrink it down. So back to our emitter, like I say, they're not seeming to react too much with the plane. So we'll go into the actual emitter's properties, and then we'll go into the plane properties. And what we've got here, we've got some different bits. We've got stickiness. This makes the actual plane sticky, so it takes some of the energy out of the particles. So if I turn it up to 10, as you can see, they more or less hit it and don't bounce. They just actually stick to it. Making this a lower value will actually introduce a little bit of bounce. But what it's doing is taking different amounts of energy out of your particles, so the bounce will get slower, lower and lower and lower the further it goes along your image. Boom, 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 boom. You've also got dampening, and if we actually take the dampening up, as you can see, because the dampening is quite good, you can actually increase the dampening, and what that does, it actually makes the actual particles sort of lose energy faster as well, but they're not actually losing any speed. Take this down to something reasonable, so it affects them. And the last one is, of course, friction. Right, friction is the actual amount that something has drag on it laterally. So as they're actually bouncing off, if I take the actual friction right up to 1, as you can see, they stop dead and start to bounce on the spot. And if I take this down a bit, as you can see, they travel further, less and less, and that might be the effect you want, because you don't want them to go too far on your plane or the explosion dies out quickly. And like I say, take the friction up to 1 and they stop immediately. But they're still bouncing because the energy and the stickiness haven't been changed. So a combination of all these can actually give you a lot of different effects. I'm going to take the friction down and down, so they go like that. So we've got our explosion, but what you can actually do to this, you can add in different objects that can affect the way this works, and that's what I did with the mushroom cloud. I did a tube and I put some loop cuts into it, and basically I made a little mushroom with a hole in the bottom of it to actually make my mushroom cloud. And then I used the combination of drag to actually make these happen. I'll just show you quickly. We'll just do, we'll add in a object, and the object we'll add in is let's just add in a mesh, and the mesh we'll add in is an icosphere. I'm just going to increase this G and Z, take it up in the air. Let's have a look at the bottom. Go into edit mode, select the bottom point, and what I'm going to do is just grow the selection just to actually delete part of my sphere. So take it a bit higher, X, and I'm going to delete the faces. So now we've got an actual shape there, and if we add a collision modifier like that, we can actually contain our explosion. I'm just going to scale it up a bit more. So put it down here, but we're going to hide it in the actual render. So I'm just going to fetch it down, G and Z, put it over the top. As you can see, it sort of catches things. And we just hide it in our render so you can't see it. So you get the idea. If you actually make a different shape, you can make this do all sorts of things. Exactly with the plane, you can actually make it sticky. So let's have a look. Let's increase the stickiness right up, and the things seem to hang in the air in a bit for a time, but they don't lose energy with stickiness. So the particle. So if we actually increase the friction, take the friction up to 1, they stick it, and they don't quite hit the ground again because they've vanished before they actually finish. Same with dampening. Increase the dampening, or take the friction back to 0, and it just dampens the actual energy that's in the particles while it's in contact with this sphere. So as you can see, you can get quite a lot of different effects. Like a contained explosion, it's like it's in a force field or something. So let's just delete the sphere out of our render, because we don't want it to actually affect our explosion in this case. So just delete the sphere. So I've deleted the sphere, but sometimes what you find out is that it's still caught up in the cache. And that's why I mentioned the cache earlier. And what we can do is, because this is now, it's actually taken on the sphere, it's took on the shape, and it's not letting it go again. So what we can do is actually go to our cache on our emitter, and what we can do is delete all bakes. So what this does is deletes all the actual physics that's applied to it, and it actually has to recalculate it again. So it'll take one run through to actually work, I'm guessing, and then it should just return back to normal. delete all. Right, press space, delete all bakes, bake all dynamics again. Yeah, so it's just forgot where it was. There we are. So we got our explosion back again. Ta-da. Deleting all bakes normally gets rid of it, but sometimes you might have to rebake it. And like I said, before you actually render it, it's always a good idea to actually rebake this. So, right, like I said, we've got our actual explosion now, but it's got no colour. I could add a simple colour to this. I'm just going to add a simple colour, new, and you can actually change the roughness. Hold on, have I forgot anything? Right, I've forgot something here. As you can see, all of these are exactly the same. You know, that hole's there, that hole's there. There's no actually rotation on these actual objects. So I'm just going to select that and actually increase and change the rotation on things. As you can see, rotation is not applied. If we open up rotation and actually select rotation, hold on, delete all bakes. If it's already baked it, then you have to use the cache to actually delete all bakes, so you can actually alter something. So I'm going to alter the rotation, and I'm going to change the randomness right up to there. And what this does now is they're not all the same direction, because we're going to change the random phase here and increase that slightly and add dynamics. What dynamics does is actually keeps things spinning, if you know what I mean. So if we actually go up here and look at this and follow a particular particle, as you can see, it's got a hole in it. When we take it on, it's just actually not spinning. So if we actually add the dynamic to it and then render it again, as you can see, things are actually spinning in the air. Let's take it a little bit higher on these for the randomness. I don't know whether you saw that, but let's just follow one particle so I can show you. So you got this particle here. If we take it on frame by frame, you can actually see maybe this one at the back. Yeah, you can see it rolling. So it is actually turning in the air. So when it hits the ground, it's working like a ball, so you're getting different angles. Same with this one here. You see it rolling towards us and rolling over. So that's what actually rotation does if you actually select the emitter. There we go. So our explosion's more or less finished. Boom. So let's work on this object here. So we've got this object here. So we're going to add a colour to it, new. And as you can see, we've got some actual bits and bobs that I'm going to change. I'm going to make it quite reflective, because what I want this to do is actually reflect other particles and also the HDRI that you might attach to your image, because you want it to actually reflect the ground plane around itself. So it's always a good idea to actually attach a sky texture or something like that, so it shows real reflection. So I've done that, and we'll go into shading, and I'll just show you some of the actual things we need to do on this. Like I said, this doesn't work actually in Eevee present. I'm sure they're working on it, and soon they'll actually get it fixed. So what we're going to do is actually change the render over into cycles like that. Now, if you've not enabled your GPU and you've still set to CPU, as you can see, it takes absolutely ages to actually draw it. But if you change it to your GPU, that speeds it up something chronic. And if you're using the actual denoising, which you tend to use, what we want to do is we actually want to use the denoiser in this scene, and want to use it in the render. So what we're going to do is open this. This actually speeds my machine up by 300% when rendering on a complex scene. So something that takes 3 seconds would take 30 times, 300 times as long. So it saves you a hell of a lot of time, and this is what you actually change. It's very simple. Go into automatic. My graphics card actually supports optics, so you change this to optics. And if we open this one, on the render I want it to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to change this to optics yet again. And as you can see now, it's actually doing it to 32 frames per frame. I'm doing this to a maximum sample rate of 32 just for the tutorial. In the actual explosion, I've changed this to 200, so you can imagine how long this took to actually do a render, which is quite a while. And as you can see, it's doing it frame by frame, but it's only drawing it to 32. And there's also this noise factor here. The bigger the noise factor, the quicker it will render. So if I change this to 0.5 in both of these, you'll see that this actual counter speeds up something chronic. So 0.5. So what it's doing is actually getting to an actual noise threshold of 0.5 and then deciding to render it. At the present, we've still got our ground plane, and you might not actually want your ground plane to be visible in your render. So let's just actually get rid of the ground plane in our render. So click on the ground plane, and we don't want it visible. So what you can do is just actually go onto the plane. We don't want it visible in our viewport, and we don't want it visible in our render, because it's just extra things for it to draw, and that enables you to actually export this as a flat plane in your scene. Enables you to actually export this as a flat plane in your scene, which can be used on your game for your various effects. You know, a sword clashing together, and then you might actually use a circle because you want the actual particles to go out in all directions, but you still might want them to hit an actual ground plane that's below the character if you know out the height of the actual ground plane, or just vanish out a couple of seconds off the actual sword, for instance. So we've got our particle or our spark, and we're just going to add some bits and bobs to it. Right, for some reason in 4.0 they actually got rid of the actual search here. There used to be a search on the top of here, and you could actually then find your actual bits and bobs quite easily in Blender, but for some reason they took it out, the search. You had a search on the top of here, but you can make that reappear by just pressing F3. So we press F3 and it fetches this up. Took quite a while to find it, and I'm just going to add some different bits. So first of all, we're going to add particle info node, which we'll put over here, because we're going to join these all up together. Now this is a really simple particle setup, so I'll just follow along and press F3 again, and I'm just now going to add what they call a math node. There we go. And then we're going to add in a color ramp. See, it's actually found under there, you see, under converter and color ramp, or you can just type in ramp by pressing the F3 key first, obviously. Color ramp, and it finds it quite quickly. Right, I'm just going to add a few other colors into this and drag the sliders out. Right, I want my explosion to start off white to start with, then actually go to yellow, then to orange, and then to red. Basically getting darker and darker as it goes along. So adjust these up, and at the end I want it to actually fade out, so I'm going to actually use a thing called alpha. So let's actually go this value into the factor. So now what it's doing is actually going on different grayscales, but we can actually change these colors in our render if we wish. Right. In fact, I don't think I want that one. Right. So the first color I'm going to make is white. Top of the shop, boom, bright white, and it was actually get this mid explosion. So, right. And if we look at this in our render, as you can see, it's not very effective, and that's because we've actually put this into our emission. Let's just actually move this over a bit so we can actually see it. I'll move it up there. Oop, no, I won't move it up there. I'll move it there, just so we can actually see it through our thing. So I'm going to actually go from color. Emission now is closed, whereas this used to be a really big long list, so we can actually just put it into emission. And like I said, we can actually put the alpha into the alpha up there. Right, it's not very bright, and the reason it's not very bright is that we've got no emission strength here, so I'll just set this to 4, and you should see that now go bright white. And then we can actually change the colours of this. I'm going to make the first one a yellow colour, quite bright yellow, and then I'm going to make this an orange colour. But you can make these blues and greens, or any colour you actually can think of. So I'll change this to an orange, still quite bright. I'm taking the intensity down on it. Make this one a red, down to the bottom. Take the intensity down a little bit more, and make this one a dark grey, and make this one quite black, very dark grey. And finally, the last colour, what I'm going to do is make this see-through. The way we do this by changing the alpha, taking it to 0, so it's now see-through. Right, what we've got here, we've got age and we've got lifetime. So we want the particle's age to be 1 divided by the actual lifetime. And I'm just going to change this to divide. Boom. So as you can see, the particles will actually fade through the colours we just created. Right, so I know it's a bit hard to see them, but that's because it's doing it frame by frame according to the actual denoising values that we set earlier. See? And it's fading out to, I think that's a bit too grey there, so I'm just going to actually change this colour to a darker black, just because I think it'll look better. So let's have a look. Wait for it to start again. There we go. So it's going white, then yellow, then orange, and it's like the actual particles are cooling down. There we go. So there we have it. And what you can do now is you can actually go back into your particles, mess around with the actual size of your particle if you want. If you want to make them smaller, just make them smaller. It's always a good idea to actually do this in this mode here, because it just enables you to actually see things, and it's drawn a lot quicker in Blender. And then you do the final render at the end once you actually got the actual explosion looking the way you want it to. So I'm just going to click on the emitter. Here's where you can actually add different kinds of particles. For the nuclear explosion, I think I did that on 3,000 particles. But if you actually turned it to 10,000 particles, I just run this. As you can see, you've got a hell of a lot more particles. But as you can see, well, it looks quite good actually. Don't look too bad at all. But you can actually shorten the length of the actual, so you can have the start at 1, or you could have it starting at frame 20 and then the end at say 30. So it's then doing it over 10 frames there. So if we go back into layout, so you can actually see the timeline. See, it doesn't start till 20, and you get an idea on the actual explosion. Let's just take it into that mode, just so we can actually see it. In this case, I think 3,000 particles is probably enough. So I'll change it to 3,000, which will actually increase the actual speed of the explosion. And this here is the lifetime. So if I did it over 2 frames, so everything happened over 2 frames, so I'll change it to 22, really is a quick explosion. Boom. It just goes boom. But as you can see, the lifetime's not long enough, so we can change the lifetime to, say, 90, which will make your particles last longer. And it's entirely up to you what you want your particles to do. I'm just going to add in another mesh and add the icosphere again, G and Z, because I want it to do something weird. So hide the sphere. I'm just going to add in the actual physics property again, collision, because I want it to actually make like a splash in the air, if you know what I mean, the explosion. So it's like a double splash. See, hide the emitter. All I've done is added the sphere, and it looks like Blender might be crashing, which happens from time to time when you're actually using particles. Let's try that again, because that should have worked quite easily. So let's add the sphere, G and Z, just see if it does it again. Might be just a glitch in time. Collision, that's it. And the closer I take that to the actual surface, it did it when I actually made it less visible. So watch, collision, and I'm just going to actually bake this again, just so we can see it this time. Delete bake, bake all dynamics, takes a little bit longer this time. There we go, boom. So basically it's hitting the invisible sphere, boom, and then splashing. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial, just to show you this explosion as it stands now. I'm just going to hide it in the actual viewport, hide it in the render, and I'm just going to actually render this out, and we'll see this at the end. Now if you enjoyed this tutorial, please subscribe to my channel, and don't forget, hit the like button and spread this with your friends if you found this useful. That's more or less it. There's only a few particles falling off. And then if you want to actually add that really bit of good things like the let's just hide the plane. If I wanted to actually change this, so if I wanted to actually have some transparency as it hits the screen, that's a bit of a weird quiver, so I'm going to take the friction down, and I'm going to use dampening just in the same way to actually try and actually get this to stay on screen. Little bit of stickiness, so I made like a splash effect. Boom. Now let's just render this out, see what it actually looks like. It's the friction. It's more like a splash now. Splash explosion. Ugh. What you can do is actually stack these actual effects, so you can actually go into your emitter and you can actually stack the actual particle effects. So ones you can have as smoke, others you can have as smoke, fire, and other bits and bobs, and different shapes. So I've stacked that one on the top. Let's just increase it like that so we get a little fountain out the top of it. So I've changed that to 2 now. Changed it to object and change it to the actual spark again. Increase the size and the randomness. Take the Z up in the air. So now we've got a secondary splash, a little fountain going out the top. Increase the randomness to actually make it go a bit higher. Same again on this, we can actually alter the actual how long you want it to happen, so it actually starts at frame 20 and ends in frame 25. And what this does, it adds little particles, actually go out randomly to the screen. And if you add in on the camera, if you then add in a depth of field, what that'll do is actually take things out of focus that are actually coming closer to the screen, which actually gives you that see-through effect that you sometimes get in cameras, or the splash effect. So let's render this out and just see what it looks like. Right, on the second particle system, it doesn't look like it's taking on colour. No. Oh no, it is. Right. And like I say, we can actually change the depth of field on the camera and the f-stop and things like that. We'll focus on the actual emitter itself. So things that actually come closer to the camera will actually distort slightly and go out of focus. And we'll see that in the render. So let's just render this, and I'll put this on the end. The only other thing I didn't show you in the render here is we can set this to FFmpeg, but as you can see, it doesn't actually do the actual steps. So I'm just going to actually save the steps where you want to actually put the actual render. In this case, I want it to be on my explosion, and also, as you can see, it's RGB, so there's no RGBA, so I can change the actual encoding. So this is QuickTime animation, and that actually supports an RGBA, or the actual invisibility that you can actually get in the image, so then it can be overlaid on another image. So I'm just going to accept that, select RGB, and I'm just going to render this out and see what it looks like. Render animation. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe to my channel, and bye for now.